this is the kind of initial thing I would give if nobody had any idea about Ember.js, or most people didn't. So we talked about JS frameworks, MVC frameworks, model view controller. People described the initial version of Ember 1.0 as MVC plus R, model view controller plus the router. Though, back is not working there, guys. Though we should say that the view was really a combination of a view JavaScript file and a template handlebars file. So you have your sort of markup and your UI command logic. So as I said, when they released sort of like what they thought was going to... Another thing that has happened recently is changed from, we discussed a little bit earlier, the two-way binding, which I really like. It's just so easy, with data down, actions up. And that is basically trying to isolate who has control over your state so that you know where state changes are coming from. And it also removes some of the internal observers they needed, which, as Tyrus was saying, made the upgrade easier to 2.0. So currently what we have in the current... this thing on my ear. In the current version of 2.0 is we have the model view controller. The view is just the template files, plus we have the router, plus we have this new thing we haven't talked about, services. And they're basically, when they had controllers, it had state, it was a singleton, and it also was related to a specific route. We'll talk about those in a second. And they've sort of split that up. The service is now the part that's going to be more stateful, and once routable components in, that will just be the specific UI at that moment. So, models. Pardon me. Suddenly started talking very loud. So, if you've done any development, certainly if you've done Ember, you know what these are. They're JavaScript files, they store data, and they store relationships. This is sort of a model for a site I'm doing, which has where people can store types of awards, or prizes, things they've received. And one of the things that Ember has with Ember Data, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is an identity map, which is basically a local Ember managed repository. Talk about it more, but it's sort of one of the most powerful things, I think, about Ember in comparison to the other frameworks. So the router, the thing that Ember was sort of most famous for, is it manages the flow of your application. If you've done a lot of server-side frameworks, you're probably used to routing in general, moving from one URL and state to another URL and state. So it works pretty similar to these paradigms. I forgot to put my example in. So I do have an example later, but so routes. And please, anyone shout out anything you need to ask at any point. So routes, each specific route, you might think of it as what would have in the past been a page or one state of a page, has its own route.js file, or it may, if it needs functionality, has its own controller, and has its own template, where your sort of markup goes. It used to be handlebars, now it's HTML bars. And it's nested. So you see the difference between the two. For the routable component in the future, it will just be a component. You will simply have to remove anything that is stateful. So if you go to a page and it has some information, and you make a change and you go to another page, now when you go back to that page, unless you've on purpose reverted it back to its previous state, it will have that same change. In the future, that may not be the case. So the two most important things in route.js files are the model hook and setup controller. So if you can see the code here for an app I'm doing, there's a title, which is for different purposes. I'm just leaning over because I can't see the screen because it's so bright. And the model hook, which takes params. Params are parameters on the URL, generally IDs of objects. And it calls from, this is using Ember data, and it calls into the store, and it goes to find a record. Find record is a call in the store that makes an API call to your backend. So it looks for an object or a model called mail, and it passes the ID that it finds on the URL. Setup controller allows us to copy the model into a specific property on the controller and to do any other setup work we want to do. Sorry, controllers. So controllers are, as you saw in setup controller, set up by the route. So they don't need to be. The route doesn't need to do anything. They may have stateful information now, but in the future that will not be possible. They'll have to have their information passed into them by the route, or by a service that's been injected into them. So they're set up by the route. They source state about the route. So if you're on my/account on any particular site, it stores state about the my account route. So one way data is bound down to the template. So the template has access to any of the properties in the controller. Same name, just using the curly braces as handlebars, and it accepts actions up. So actions that get triggered, whether they are simply to update a property in a model, which might happen if you have text field, and it might have an onChange that calls an action to update its data, or to save something, save that data and persist it to your database, or whatever your API is doing. So again, this is sort of gets us to, if you replace in this is by Sugar Pirate. It's just a nice version, I think, of looking at this. So if you look at what it says as routable component, and you just think right now that's a controller, everything else is sort of exactly the same. You navigate to a route, it requests some information from the store, which either gets the information from the local memory in the browser, or it makes a API call to your server. It retrieves that information, it puts it into whatever object you have. It then sets that information in the setup controller into the controller. That controller then makes that property available to the template. So if you take away routable component, make that controller, and then components is either components or the template itself, then that data is available, and when actions are called, currently they're called on the controller, though there is an add-on to push them all the way up to the route, so you're not maintaining the state in the controller anymore. I'm not sure if I find that to be the easier way to do it, because I'm not sure how the implementation of routable component might change that, but that ends up being the data flow. So you hit a route, it knows some information, either because you're logged in, or because of what's on the URL, or default data that it has. It may load additional data from an API or from local data that was where the API was hit previously, and will allow you to render that.
Can I
shoot?
Before we go further, so we're talking about something that is very. This is kind of abstractly describing something that you do on a day-to-day while doing Ember development. Like, there's a very common pattern when you actually thinking about how you're going to architect a part of the application. Your starting point is always, I have a URL that describes what data is going to be fetched. You're going to then use that information to fetch the data, and you're going to display that data to the user. So before we go further, I just want to make sure, like, are there questions about this part particular? Because I feel like this is quite important in terms of how Ember operates, and I'm not sure how much more we like how much deeper we're going to get into the specific part.
No deeper.
Right, and so I want to make sure that that if you have questions that are kind of tangential or like kind of around about this, I think now would be a great time to ask them.
Please don't be shy, because if you feel like, and I don't know who knows what, but please don't be shy about asking something that you feel like because we've said earlier that more people are Ember developers. Much rather have people ask a question, because a lot of times other people around you might have similar questions, and it's always good to talk about it. So,
Todd.
So you started by mentioning that Ember model view controller. So can you explain a little bit where a component would fit into that?
sure, yeah. One of the things in this intro that I actually described the least is components. Not because I think they're the least important. In some ways, they're becoming more and more important. But because I think of a component as sort of being a very similar pattern than you would use if right now you just had a controller and a template, but your controller did not have stateful data that people left the route and came back to it. If you didn't have that and you had the controller and the template and you fired actions, that pattern is, except for the isolation and reusability, which are important, is sort of the exact same pattern that you're gonna build in your components. Some people do. Some people will bubble actions from components. So you have data in a component for a form, and some people will, in the action that goes to the component's JavaScript file, so there's a template and a JavaScript file. Some people will update the data and make the call to the store and therefore to the API to save the data in the component.js file. Some people think this is terrible and that you should bubble that up to the next level and let the controller or the route handle it. I don't really have a huge opinion, but once you understand the paradigm of the controller and the templates, the component is just a smaller version of that on a smaller scale, but not stateful.
So earlier you described React as kind of the view layer of the application. Would the component tree kind of be similar to React for functionality, where it can provide a component tree for Ember?
I don't know enough about React to be able to say how close I think it is.
Okay.
I think that.
Would you say it falls more in kind of a view layer, like your components?
Todd, what do you think?
I think it's more describing the view than routing when you're talking about pure components.
So I think one thing that one thing to think about the different parts of. I'm going to go up front, and I'll let you keep that because you probably have good questions. One way that, like, the way I think about how to architect a part of the application. So the first step is you're going to get some data from the route. So that's kind of like you fetch kind of like macro data. There's a bunch of things that you're going to that you need to do to present the initial page. So that might be like a list of items for a user. You know, a user went to expecting to see a list, they see a list, and then from there you want to give user specific interactions with that data, but then you want to be able to break up how you present that into smaller components. So that's kind of where components come in. Components allow you to break down specific representation of data and behaviors into smaller pieces that are easier to manage. And that can be deeply nested. You could have deeply nested components, which will give you kind of a component tree of what Todd you described, right?
Yeah.
Is that a...
Yeah, I guess they're...
The one point I would make about the way that I see it slightly differently, thinking about sort of the history of how these frameworks come about, which is sort of thinking about sort of separation of concerns. In the past, you sort of had business logic, which was in Ember 1.0, you had business logic that was in the controller, and then you had markup, which was in handlebars, and then you had a Vue.js file that might be doing some things related specifically to sort of DOM interactions and whatever. So at that point, I think you could say that the view and the template were the view layer, and you were sort of just pushing data, and whether it was two-way binding or not, that would seem like the view layer. I think with components, especially if you're thinking about web components where at some point some things might be portable, so it might be that you have actually some business logic that are actually working inside the components, and I would say that probably makes it not purely view layer. Some people are sort of, I think, are of the opinion and that it really should be, and some aren't. You know, I tend to think your use cases may differ.
Yeah.
But
Could you see them as like small kind of MVC reusable pieces without routing, of course, and state?
I mean, it gets broken down further and further. Like it actually makes it makes the macro MVC like micro MVC as you get deeper and deeper and
Within a
more
component,
further
you're
nested.
splitting out a template in JavaScript logic. Anyways, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to derail anything.
I think is it turtles all the way down or elephants all the way down? I'm not sure. Turtles. It's turtles all the way down. That's the way I would describe it.
It's so the actual so to make this more tangible, you have to actually start to put thoughts to code, and so that's one of the things that we're going to be doing in the training session on Monday and Tuesday. The intention with this workshop is to give us an opportunity to set some context for why Ember is the way it is, and then hopefully when you start to write code, you actually have a bit of more understanding in terms of why things are the way that they are, as opposed to just kind of blind, like just kind of following a guide and just typing some code in. So.
Okay. Yeah, and I think the basics, like you can think of Ember without having to deal with the components. I think maybe is what you were getting at, because you can have.
I think if you're doing your
route
first
that
Ember
goes
app, I
to-
wouldn't think about components at all, because
Interesting, okay.
you'll generally understand it, and then if people say,
Yeah.
you add a component, it has a JavaScript and a
Yeah.
template, and you pass data to it, and
Yeah.
data comes back from it, then I think it just makes sense.
So basically, you can build a page without actually using components by just using the route with the template.
This is another philosophical difference, which is,
Yeah,
oh, sorry. The philosophical difference, which is I sort of come from an OOP world where I would build something, and then when I knew I needed to use it in a second place, then I would, break it out into something smaller that I could then, whether it's an interface or a superclass or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tend to do that in Ember and doing front-end development. So I will put things in templates directly under the route. And then when I realize I have a use case to have them in more than one place, I will pull them out. Some people try to make sort of everything from the get-go components. To me, that's a little bit more complicated, it's a little bit more advanced. It really depends on how you think.
It's actually I've seen a lot of code like that, and every time that I've seen it, I see a developer that's really confused with what's going on. So that's why I think your suggestions to start with just route, controller, and template is really great starting point.
Yeah.
And then as you start to understand more about the specific user experience that a very specific part of your template does, then you can break that into a separate component, because there's maybe an aspect of reuse somewhere where you need to represent that same thing somewhere else. That pattern that I've seen work well.
I will talk about this a little bit later, but one of the things that makes me take this strategy as opposed to thinking about it as a component is if you were building a JSP or ASP.NET app and you had 2 pages in that app, and you wanted a header and a footer, then in general you're going to be including those in every page that you want to look like them. But there are going to be different versions of them, and you're going to be re-rendering the whole page. You're not only rendering part of the page. And in Ember, because I'll talk about it at some point, when your UI is nested, your route should be nested, and sort of vice versa, that when you nest your area, sub-routes under accounts, but what would be 5 different pages, then if you have a specific header for the account area, it's just going to be in the main account template, and then all of the routes under it are going to be rendered inside a smaller portion do that. These things is set. If you need to have the same thing in multiple different sub-routes with weirdly different use cases, then you're going to say, okay, well, I don't want to have where they are. I've tested multiple places, and again, component, isolating it probably makes that easier, but I'm needing it.
I, like, I like it. I think it's
And so just a little bit to the difference between kind of state kept in the controller versus in the model.
the best way to tell you for an instance of an Ember model class. So things that are so models are your API are going to stay in your they will often the product will live on the model.
Is really data UI as you are currently doing it. And that data is based on model data, but I'll show a little bit of a demo later that you'll see that you can sort of persist some of those as well.
Yeah, so there's going to be a difference between UI state and your backend business data
State, yeah. I wish we had more words.
And one of the things that and this is, I'm not sure if too advanced, not advanced enough, but if you go into a route now with the controllers the way they currently are, and you toggle a property to show or not show something, the default behavior if you leave that route to go somewhere else and come back is that property, because the controller is a singleton, it's not being destroyed in the DOM and then being rebuilt in the DOM with its default values. It's a singleton, it's long-lived. The next time you go there, the fifth time you go there, it maintains whatever data is there until you refresh the app or you change the data.
Yeah.
The model, when you pull the model from your server, it has the data that is the same as your server and an Ember data that lives in the identity map. You update that data. That is also stateful, but that is stateful regardless of what route you're on. And only once you actually call save on that model will it persist that data to your API. Can anyone see this? I can barely see it from here. I don't know. This is just a whole bunch of. So I mean, this is just a sample controller. I'm injecting another controller because I'm upgrading an app, and I'm sort of using controllers to get information from other controllers. That is also one of the reasons why they're moving to services. So, because if I have been to a specific controller and made some changes, the data might be different than if I go to this separate route, but it injects the controller, but that controller has not been set up by its setup controller in the model of the route. Okay, I probably should talk slower. But this isn't that important for now. So views do not exist anymore. They're just templates, which are HTML bars now, used to be handlebars, or handlebars 2, I don't know what you want to call it. They use the curly brace syntax, which you may be familiar with in a lot of languages. Now we have Glimmer, and soon we're having Glimmer 2, which apparently is going to be some dramatically wonderful paradigm shift that I'm not 100% sure about, but in terms of how it works and how they've sort of broken apart the parts that are in Ember and the parts that are in the compiler. I'm not exactly sure what that does, but I've heard it does. The templates render your HTML and your dynamic elements. There are things in curly braces. It has loops, and this is a UI. You'll see some image tags, some span tags. You'll see some components, paper content, paper list, menu item. That's from a library called Ember Paper. an unless tag, which is sort of the opposite of an if tag. You have an if tag, which is inline, which does not have the hash in front of it, so it's just, there's no begin and end brace. One of the things that's good about components, for reuse at least, is that components can be inline, where they're just curly braces, or they can have start and end tags and wrap content that they have access to and can do things with. So that's interesting. So helpers, it's just code that allows you to sort of add UI-based logic to your templates. You know, this is one that I've written for it's like date format. So it takes a JavaScript data in, has a sort of a couple of defaults, and then returns a string version of that with a certain format, just the way you would want to display certain dates one way, certain dates another. And you can't call JavaScript functions from HTML bars. You need to create a helper that does it, or have a property on the controller that returns the string. This is one from a more complicated one from one of Steph Penner's add-ons. Also does date stuff. Moment from now, so sent, moment from now. Sent is the date property on the model, and interval is sort of how often it's updating. So it is recalculating itself every 1 second, every 1,000 milliseconds. So services, I'm not going to go too deep into this. We've talked a lot about it, but they're replacing the stateful parts of controllers, but in a less route-specific way. So I have one for an app called Session Manager, so it manages person's logged-in session, as opposed to in the past where you might have stored that data in the application controller, which is sort of the top of your routing system. Now you do it there, which is actually helpful, because if you have logged in and non-logged in parts of your app that are under your application controller, it gives you a little bit more flexibility. So this is a service that I might use. It basically does something. It has some state, but I don't need to go too deep. So components, I'm not actually going too much into code. We've talked about some. It's isolated. It has a template, which is HTML bars, a component file, which is JavaScript. Data down, actions up, which we talked about as well. Same diagram, which I like. So this is sort of this is an example of a component I have. And this is the associated template. And the logic in the component and the logic on the back end are related to there is some logic, in this HTML bars file. This logic is based on what you're seeing or what you're allowed to do, and the logic in this file is based on business logic or what you need to save in this case. This is just like a quick task list that you can just add a task to, and it observes that you've entered a new thing. Shoot.
I just wanted to ask about the isolation components.
Sure.
Yeah, let me just get this.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask.
Isolation, I should put it.
So, one, I don't use Ember. I'm not familiar with it. Can you nest components?
Yes.
And passing data to and from, can you pass down but not pass up, sort of thing?
So if you think of it, it will work exactly sort of in the data down actions up way, which is that you can, if you have a component and inside that component you call another component, or in a component you wrap another component that wraps another component, what you end up doing is you're binding in the sort of description of the, let's see, do I have any? I don't have it. So I mean, let's see, go back to one that has a. Okay, so this doesn't have an action associated with it, but actually no, that's just a helper. What am I doing?
Do you want me to try?
No, I'm just looking for a component, but I don't have any component code here. So, I mean, you're doing a similar thing where you're binding the value down from one to another, and whenever any action happens in one that needs to cause a follow-up action in the component that it's related to. So generally you're going to bind a value, so your value equals whatever the name of your property is, and then on click or action, you're going to say what function it's going to call when in the parent component when that gets triggered. And then so the information is bound down, and it's isolated because once it's bound down into that component, the only way that it's going to change, or it should be able to change, is when an action pushes data up, and then some other action, or maybe that action triggers some persistence or some additional thing that you're going to do with that data. So because JavaScript is not as strict as other languages, it has lots of flexibility, certainly there are ways that those things are not, I wouldn't say mandated, but they aren't totally controlled by Ember, but the convention of how you would do them and the effect it would have is isolation. Something you want to add?
Does that help? Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to picture each component has its own template, within that template you can invoke other components. So you just drop them in like you would right into markup, and then you pass the data as arguments to those.
So there's really two ways to think about it. One is that I have a component called user list, and in it I have a header that has some sort of title that maybe gets passed in and nothing gets done with. And then I have a list of users that I have a for loop over or an each loop over, and I display each user. And then I want to be able to, and each user itself might be in this loop, might be its own component, where you pass in the user in your each loop. And then when you want to do something, it may call an action up to the component that it's inside. You pass in the action. So you're going to pass in the action to the nested component. The other use case is maybe a little harder to explain, is if you have a component that wraps other components inside of it and yields that content, then I'm not sure if that's how would you describe that interaction between?
That's a little bit tricky to describe conceptually, but
that's why I was asking you to do it, because I drew a blank.
So say you had a list of users you were displaying on the screen, but you wanted that component to be flexible enough to say, I have one list where I want to display the picture of the user on each row, and then another list where I'm just displaying his name. Then we yield up to the person who's the piece of the application that's defining the component to say, I want my internals to look like this. And so it actually is just yielding data to that middle part, and then the parent can decide how to display it.
Can I just point out, having done Ember for 3 years, and I don't think that's a bad description of it. I find how wrapped components and wrapped components that have components in them are yielding themselves. I find that to be incredibly complicated to understand in the abstract. The only way that I've been able to truly describe it to people and make it something that people, something I'm not going to be able to do now, unfortunately, is to have a very specific use case and to be able to show them how the information is going back and forth. Then it is actually quite easy to understand in the specific use case. But in its abstract form, it feels like, okay, you have data, and your data's within data, and your data's within data, and I feel like it's that exhibit meme should be coming out. So I heard that you like to yield in your components, so I yielded your components or whatever.
So we have later on what we can do is if we have time, so I can either do it one-on-one, I can actually show you, or we can do it live. I'm gonna have some I'm gonna have opportunities to show some code, so we can actually show what that looks like, and then see how that works. I think that might help to clarify this.
You asked about isolation. Wow, that's loud. You can shoot yourself in the foot and change, data passed in from the component. I think you mentioned, because it's JavaScript, if you pass an object, you can just set some object, but it's not really a suggested. Yeah,
JavaScript is like an open carry state. The chance to shoot yourself in the foot is going to be high.
Yeah.
Because it's just, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Just trying to make it a little bit difficult, more difficult to shoot yourself in the foot, but it's just basically you have to kind of learn what are
Either
good things to do
works.
and then don't do the bad things, basically.
So it's been an hour and a half. I think we probably should take a break after this one, and then I'll do just a quick overview of Ember CLI, and then,
Traceable, right?
well, I'm just going to do like a
Oh, okay. Intro.
5 slides that explains it, and then she's going to go through it.
All right, sounds good. Cool. So we can take a break, and we're happy to answer questions one-on-one if those arise.
Or 3-on-1.
Or-
Have to be 1-on-1. They don't restrict it. I do need some water, though.
All right. Good job. Can you turn me off? Ah!